a senior technical project manager and consultant. Worked with several agencies over the years in the Drupal space. I actually started out as a software developer, got a bachelor's in networking technology originally, but went into software development quite soon after. And I've been around for a little while. You know, I would say I've had some experiences with a lot of different agencies, either corporate and or agencies. So what I'm going to talk about here today is maximizing project success. And really, I think that it all starts with getting started somewhere. You know, I think we often, in the agency space especially, have some hiccups that can happen when you're just getting your project off the ground. So let's get started. You know, this initial sort of meeting needs to happen, I think, and it might be missed, is the internal sales handoff. You might have a situation, or you might have experienced a situation before where a sales team, you know, meets with a client, sells a contract, gets them to sign a contract, and then that document is just handed over to the project management team, development team, or otherwise, and they're expected to just execute on it, you know, just off a piece of paper, more or less. But really, having this internal sales handoff, just having simple meeting about what is that scope, what are the timelines, what are the milestones, if you have any, of course, what is the general scope. But really, it's more important, I think, to talk about the nuances. What are the motivations of this particular client? Why are they wanting to create this feature, this new rebuild, or whatever it is that they're contracted for you or with you? And also, part of this might be really finding the right project management fit as well. So, you know, just identifying which on your team would be best to work with this particular client. You might even set it up for success right at the beginning and talk a little bit about next steps. You know, kind of what are we doing next, internally and externally. Just start thinking about that next. Now, this might be an example of a email that you would send out or a communication that you would send out to a client that you would want to ask things like, who should attend the kickoff workshop? When should it take place? I found that simple things like including a link to an easy scheduler like MS Booking or Calendly or something like that can take a lot of effort out of just simply scheduling the kickoff. But really having this like tone set right up front where you are, you know, asking for information, you're being friendly, you're being open, you're asking for people to really open up to you in a lot of ways, to include, and I think that this is more and more important these days, any sort of accessibility concerns that you might have or that the client side might have. Maybe they need to take a break every few minutes during a kickoff. Sometimes our kickoffs, depending upon team size, can be 1 to 3 hours long. I've seen them go very long, and so it might be a good idea to have some of those considerations in there as well. Beyond the sort of normal accessibility concerns that you would think about. You might also utilize this kickoff sort of ceremony with a client if there are major changes to, let's say, a lead developer, or maybe you're handing off to a completely different team. Maybe on the client side, they're taking over the project in the middle. So just go ahead and use this like as a template and go through the kickoff, you know, with the new team or the new phase. So throughout my talk here, you know, I'm really more interested in hearing from y'all what your initial communications look like, and let's talk about like ways that you might align with your client and or internally. So emails are probably very common. I've also heard example of using some sort of spreadsheet or form to ask a series of questions, you know, to the client, that sort of thing. But what do your initial communications with the project team and or client look like? Anybody have any other types? Alrighty. Now, when kicking off or doing that ceremony, it's important to, like I was saying, set the tone. You would want to have alignment and inclusion and transparency. Contracting and implementing can be easy, you know, to some extent. because you might have done that sort of contract before. So you can just template that and write up a contract. But the risks with kicking off and or running the project haphazardly is that you might have delays and or overruns. You might miss milestones. I think these are all common challenges that we probably faced before in projects. And it's really important to identify early, if you can, by end of the kickoff, about things like your resources. Who your client contacts are specifically could be a really good point to make sure. Because not always do you know all the client contacts until you get into that kickoff meeting or shortly after. You might know your point of contact or the person who signed the contract, that sort of thing. But you might not know who all the stakeholders are, for instance, or team members that are just involved on the client side. So it's important to capture that as well. I would encourage. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I thought something that we would try to ask, who are the authorized people on the client side who can actually add to the scope. Because a lot of times, everyone on the client side is asking for things, and they're not necessarily authorized to expand the scope and budget of the project. So
Sure.
try to clarify that.
Yeah, just not only who are the decision makers, but who is actually approved. So identifying who those approvers are on the client side as well to make changes to scope. Great point. That is a good point there as well. And if possible, leverage templating. So if you have your kickoff email, like I was showing before, if you have a spreadsheet, if you have some list of questions, make sure that you are leveraging that information and using it moving forward to your other projects, in general within your PMO. So in regards to the client kickoff specifically, that workshop, that client-facing workshop, it's important to cover things you might have done a million times, but again, having a checklist is a good idea. Make sure you go over the goals, that you have a communication plan, that you have a timeline, and this doesn't have to be super detailed. We're just talking high-level milestones that we're at least communicating right off the bat, if we can, about what's going on with that project in the next several weeks, that planning iteration or something to that effect. Your agenda items might include things like intros and icebreakers. I've actually found the icebreaker portion of kickoffs to be the most valuable, to be honest, because really, if you can get people to talk more on a personal level about who they are, where they come from, what their mission is, what their goals are, you're going to be able to break down those barriers early on in the process, get people to talk about things they might have otherwise been tentative about talking about during the project. And again, you can have risks with overruns and things like that if you don't have that. Now, I know that probably a lot of you have done icebreakers during your kickoff, but it might be good to be a little bit more thoughtful about the questions that you pose to the kickoff, or during the kickoff with the icebreaker. Things like, what would constitute a perfect day for you? It might, tell something a little bit more about a person. Or given the choice of anyone in the world, whom would you want as a dinner guest? So, some of these things might kind of get people out of their shell and really talk about themselves a little bit more and be able to align teams, the team with the client side in general. Some risks with being so open and honest, I'll be honest, is there might be some internal politics that you weren't aware of on the client side that don't really come out until this kickoff workshop. So just to keep that in mind, that you might want to have a discussion with that point of contact to understand maybe some of those things that might be, might come up. They might also have conflicting goals specifically. Let's say like at a university, you have a new contract with the university, there's multi-departments that are affected by this project, they all want to be involved. If you have multiple stakeholders from different departments, might not have even talked to each other before until this kickoff workshop. Just to keep in mind, there may be conflicting goals between these different departments. But honestly, this could be a real opportunity as well. I think that if you keep a positive sort of outlook, that you keep focused on the goals, keep it open in general, there can be great opportunity for those departments to work together that they might not have before in a way that They get to merge their efforts together and or utilize shared resources across the departments that they might have not thought were opportunities previously. All sorts of things I've seen pop up with having these departments work together. Optionally, you might include something like meeting cadence. And by the way, those icebreaker questions, if you wanted to take a QR code shot of this, there's a whole long list of those icebreaker questions. I just gave you a couple. But optionally, like I was saying, you could include some information about what to expect your meeting cadence to be moving forward in that project. If you can, if it makes sense. If it's, I think sometimes if you have a very large group talking about something as menial as meeting cadence to the entire large group might not make sense, but it can be helpful in order to set up that success for next and that focus on next. Now for the internal kickoff, it would be something similar, though it might have more of a party element, or more of a rah-rah, if you've heard of these meetings referred to as before. You would want to reinforce with your internal team, the client overview, the overview of the client, the timeline and the scope, those sorts of basic things. But this is really an opportunity for all of the team members on the internal side to get together and talk about the project. Whereas the client-facing might have only included the leads from the internal side, let's say. So this is the opportunity for all of the team members for development, design, strategy, any of those departments to get together and really get to know each other. They might not have worked with each other either on your, and I've seen that happen a lot in agencies where certain resources will work on certain projects and they never get a chance to work with some of those other team members within the organization until a particular project comes up and now they have someone new that they're going to be working with. So agenda items here would be not only your intros and doing maybe some icebreaker if it makes sense, but talking about the roles that each of the team members will be playing. Because again, in agency, I've seen this happen before where you might have a lead developer that's more focused on front end, or is a full stack type person that's more focused on front end for one project and more focused on back end for another project. So just being real clear about what their role is on that particular project, and that we're all in alignment with that. Maybe the person's not as comfortable with doing the thing that you thought that they would be comfortable with doing for this particular project. So giving them a space to really talk about that, and really as a project manager to identify gaps in those resourcing needs so that you can address them as soon as possible. But I will say one other thing that is missed a lot is just simple onboarding instructions. From a development perspective, I've had an internal kickoff happen where you have the contract that you're discussing, you get the team to talk to each other, and immediately afterwards in the Slack channel they're asking, what's the repo? Do we have a CI/CD? What's going on with the project assets? Do we have digital assets? So maybe just preparing that, having that onboarding process, meet with your lead prior to potentially capture your dev lead and capture all that information in a document that you can share during kickoff. So they don't have to ask those questions afterwards. Now, things will come up, but the more that you can provide them during kickoff, probably the better. One other thing to mention maybe here as well is that if you have a very large multi-matrixed internal team environment, working on different features, let's say, in an agile release train, you might have the rah-rah meetings like separate, meaning you have these separate feature teams doing separate, meetings just to talk about their particular feature set. And so you'd have like your lead internal sort of kickoff, and then you'd have your separate team kickoffs as well. But that is not as frequent, I would say. After kickoff, you really want to keep it going. It's easy to lose steam. The purpose here is to talk about repetition and adding value. So what I mean here is when we're referring to like the contacts, for instance, and you might want to take this down this chart with a scan code. You might want to go through this exercise, and you don't have to necessarily do this every single time, but but thinking about, how often and to what level of detail that you need to inform each of the decision makers and or key contacts or stakeholders or CEO within the project on the client side, and internally to some extent. You could do this in an internal RACI chart as well. But yeah, I think it's a good exercise to go through to do a stakeholder analysis and identify, how often you should be talking with and reporting to individuals within the project. The reason here is to reduce noise, because I think the worst thing that can happen is a situation where you have a CEO or a department head that's receiving too many communications or too high level of detail where they're not able to absorb what's going on. And inevitably you're going to get the question of, I've been ignoring your messages because I don't have enough time to do that. And but I need to know, right? At the same time, I need to know what's going on. So yeah, go through an exercise like this. This might be as simple as, honestly, not necessarily going through a chart like this, but just having a Confluence page with point of contacts and like what they're responsible for. And that will help to inform not only yourself, if you're running multiple projects, or if you need to hand it off to another project manager that's going on a vacation for a week, giving them some resource to be able to look to run that project for you for that time that you're away. Let me go ahead and get into a couple other things a little bit quicker here, because I want to take my time to talk a little bit more about the next section. But this might be an email that you would send out after the kickoffs, just again to kind of set everybody with these expectations that this is the kind of communications we're going to see, that we're focusing on next, so that we're just all in alignment, as we're going through the project. And you might include a snapshot of the timeline with that initial email after kickoff. Really what I want to talk about here today is this part, to do with discovery first. Now I think a lot of people in agencies recognize that you don't know what you don't know until you start doing it. You can have a situation easily where, there's this sort of cart before the horse syndrome, or you end up inadvertently subjecting clients to like a smoke and mirrors situation, especially from contract to implementation, especially if you don't have design in the room with the client, and there's just a complete handoff from design. That's a lot of assumptions going on. So to avoid this pitfall, it's imperative to have a clear set of criteria towards those project goals, and it bridges the gap between research, strategy, and implementation. Now, just a quick look at like a world without a discovery first approach. You would have this potential situation where you get your proposal and sign off. Again, I think that part we've all figured out as agencies how to do that. And then you go into your design and or proof of concept. Sure, we're fine right there too. But, we have a thing we discovered. Something that was a feature that we wanted that might require a little bit more work to either figure out or to implement. And now it's going to blow the budget. Now we have to go back to the client and ask for more money or more time. So here we go with the change order. All right, now we've got that. Let's go ahead and get into build. So we start building the product. I think we're going pretty well. But we found another discovery. We need to go back to the client and ask for more money or more time. These sorts of conversations are not easy to have, and we don't want to have, if we can try to avoid those in general. I've had an example where a redesign this is a while back, from a D7 to a D9 client, they wanted a decoupled Drupal backend using Layout Builder with a Gatsby front end, and for the developer on their side to own all of the Gatsby front end work, which was a little strange, right? But at the same time, it required being in constant contact with them as far as what was going on with the project if they're going to be involved with development. Now, cherry on top was content moderation was not included in the scope of the contract, even though it was generally expected to occur. Okay, so now we're dealing with a lot of manual content creation, and oftentimes It's going to be team members across the board. They're going to be involved in creating that content manually. We don't want to be upside down on our projects because we're missing things like this. So, I am curious, any other horror stories, good stories? Has anybody else experienced this before? I've seen some nods in this direction. I think everybody's kind of experienced this before, right, in general? You have a situation you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, anytime the client wants their internal person to be part of the development, and somehow you're supposed to be supporting that person, making that person successful, and but it's really outside of your power to make somebody else successful. That's always a danger zone whenever you're okay, so the project can't succeed unless that person that is out of our control succeeds.
Higher risks and higher dependencies if you have outside developers or client-side developers that are involved. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would try to structure the project this is what we're delivering, and we can give this person this amount of support. We can't guarantee the success of their side.
Sure, and I think in contracting you do see that. Have you had that situation before, that at least in your contracting you're kind of reducing your liability by defining those sort of guide rails between what you can do and what you can't do, and that there's a high risk sort of called out.
And then that
at
person
least
always has the ear of the internal people. So they're always going to be able to blame the vendor, that if they're not able to get their part done, it's always the vendor's fault. You don't have that advantage of being able to whisper in people's ears all the time. So
right.
it's always
Right.
dangerous.
So, I mean, having a really good relationship with those key contacts, between your internal development and that client development team is really important. I would imagine that's one thing, right? But yeah, let's maybe get into some solutioning here in a minute. I'm sorry, Chris?
I was just going to add to that point, I think that's one scenario I've certainly experienced as well. One of the situations was almost the opposite of that, where this was the state of Washington, also a little bit back, and it's state contract. They hold all the cards. The only cards you hold are the contracts. And so to not only in your contracts, but also in pitch and assumptions, knowing, hey, probably from the onset, our team needs to be involved to this degree, and a deadline, budget, that's you, right? But with them involved, who knows what would pop up that might take this person entirely off the project for potentially weeks, and it's well, what happened, boss person? And it's well, that was unavoidable, or they don't even respond, and then you're dealing with the direct person who's just hey, I just do my job.
Right.
So without that being completely spelled out in your assumptions, our timeline is entirely dependent on this, initial it, and in your contract, we won't be able to do this, we cannot guarantee this, we cannot guarantee that.
Maybe a lack of communications clause would be helpful in that situation as well, right?
You just can't, you have to make sure that you aren't afraid to quantify that, or you will get bit later, because anybody that can take latitude will take latitude, in my experience.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes that's missed in contracting, I would say. Though I've seen it more so that those things, as you mature as an agency, or as you mature as contracting house, you might have those clauses kind of built in, right? But yeah, having that, even just, I've had situations too where the clauses are there, but the terms are there, but nobody fully read everything or understood everything or trusted everything or want to follow everything in a way too. So it might be good to include some of that with your key point of contacts and decision makers initially, that's a risk that they need to pay attention to. Are you really prepared to do the things and engage in a way that's going to be valuable, right? So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. A world with a discovery first approach, what I'm talking about here is kind of a really simple concept. It's very agile in a lot of ways, just from a mindset perspective. But what we're talking about is, and it relates to contracting, I'll talk to that a little bit here. But from a management standpoint, let's talk about what it would look like to do a discovery first approach. So let's talk again. Requirements and envisioning. If you break out into a phase sort of approach here, where you are focused on just those first deliverables within the first part of the project, like requirements and envisioning, for instance, you can then cycle through and build on those requirements and envisioning steps. Focus on that. Work with your client. Do your demos. Do your retros. And deploy internally, deploy to a test environment, to a staging environment if it makes sense. But still, do the full sort of cycle within your phase. It reduces risk, reduces downtime between sprints as well, reduces burnout because we're really focused on this phase of the project. It can also be a really good selling point because if you do the contracting piece where you say, I am defining all of these milestones, I am defining a range, even ideally if you can, a range, a price range to deliver that particular phase with the client. I've signed them. I've had them signed, where they will become more comfortable to some degree to say, we know there's high risk, so why don't we think about it as several phases, and that it might cost anywhere from here to here in order to deliver that particular phase. Now, they might still need to earmark the entire thing, so you want to estimate for the entire thing as best you can for a lot of clients. But, thinking on a phased way, even in contracting, can help here. And it can be a selling point. So, think of it this way too, that from a client perspective, if you're saying, I only need you to sign this first phase, like in some cases, you can sell it that way. You can say, why don't we just try this out? Why don't we do just the discovery portion of the project? Let's see if we work well together, especially good with new clients. Let's see if the teams can work well together, can come up with a good vision for the design, or high-level design, let's say. And then you can take that and go somewhere else, or use it internally, or whatever you want to do with it. I usually will get signed just based on that. And then because you're building this rapport during that first phase of the project, you will be able to really sell them on the next phase of the project. So if you even need to do another contract, if that's the situation, they'll sign it. They'll want to stick with you because they know that you work well with them. Now, with this phased approach, you can think of it like this. This is kind of an onion diagram here about it. That in this example that I was talking about, this envisioning, requirements and envisioning phase, that might contain things like the needs of the project, the sort of high-level requirements, the proof of concept, actual design prototype. It may also, this can kind of shift a little bit. It might include a little bit of technical approach and a high-level design. But it's really up to you to how you want to break this out. The suggestions here for phasing names is completely up to you, but they're just suggestions. So use as you would, not meant to be prescriptive here. Use it as makes sense for your project. There's a reference here in the benefits of prototyping and validation. And I think really the point here is that if you can get that POC and or that prototype early in the process, and notice it's like before design or full design. We're talking about really thinking seriously about being agile here. We're talking about going back to our roots and figuring out what that main feature is that they're really coming to you for, and focusing on how that would work, how that would feel, how that would affect the outcome or success of that project. So digging into this just a little bit more, the execution here is that you have your deliverables as epics, or you could do it this way when you're managing the project. And these, circles are kind of the sort of general features and or epics that we're talking about here. Before the phase, you would have your sprints defined and your goals and features and requirements set. So this is kind of thinking from a scaled agile perspective, if anyone is familiar with SAFe and scaled agile. But the idea is that you're really preparing for a planning iteration for a particular phase prior to, and then you go and meet with your entire team, figure out all of those things that you're going to do with each other, where your risks and dependencies are across the different teams. But really having a good idea about what those goals and those features are within that particular phase and or planning interval. And you want to try to figure that out before you start your phase. This is really a period of time before you start that you're planning to start. And then during, you are refining your stories, getting them sized, doing your estimation. You are identifying any additional dependencies that you might not have known about before, and you're placing your stories in those sprints and iterations. Then when you're actually running your sprints, you're defining your tasks and assigning to those leads and having them implement. Now, what I'm talking about here is a lot of planning that kind of happens before, but I would say that most developers, the thing that they've had the biggest pain point for them was not taking the time, like looking retroactively, not taking the time to do more planning up front in order to take advantage of understanding the feature set a little bit better and being able to implement and succeed in delivering on your milestones. So take the time. And just to give you an example here of what we're talking about, we have the deliverable. We are sprinting over that particular deliverable, and that's all I was trying to say there. So, has anyone worked with a multi-phase project before? I mean, has this worked well? Has it not worked well? If you haven't, maybe, do you think that you could implement something like this? So I see some nods over here. You have done a multi-phase project before. Okay. And has it worked well for you?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody have not used this sort of very hard, like opinionated phasing sort of thing that I'm suggesting?
We've been working on a website for 4 years for one of our clients. I've been on it for 2+ years.
Uh-huh.
So it's just ongoing phases, really.
Mm.
I mean, there might be a new,
A new strategic initiative.
yeah,
like
but
sort
then there's a lot of different maintenance or smaller features and
Sure.
things like that. So, but it's just like ongoing for years.
more common for maintenance and
But there's different, initiatives along the way. It's like, oh, here's a new website that's got a little discovery, and then we're going to build
So
that.
with builds you've
Yeah.
had or redesigns you've done phased approach as well. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, I would say that it doesn't always happen, and when it doesn't, it's disaster waiting to happen. I would say for most part, but I mean it depends upon the intensity and size of the project as well, right? I mean, it may be literally that your project is only focused on one feature.
No.
So if it's not that, if it's that, you probably don't need this, right?
Yeah.
But usually there's multi-features that we're dealing with, right? Anybody else have any other stories that they wanted to share about how multi-phased has or has not worked? Chris?
I would just say that, when I worked at Accenture, they would not proceed with a project unless it was this way.
Mm-hmm.
And if clients somehow had it in their mind, it was like, oh no, it's gonna be great, it's gonna be fine, we don't need that, they would just be like, no way. And if we were to do this, there was a plus or minus 50% contingency versus the usual 10 or 12.
Okay.
So, sure, but we can't guarantee anything.
So yeah, I mean, even in sort of like a highly opinionated clients where they want things contractually sort of a certain way, you have still been able to.
A faction within a company where they're already a client. There's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
Yet these people like it this way. And sure, we get that, all of our other legacy commitments and so on, yet this is the only thing we can commit to for you. Otherwise, what we recommend is to set a discovery session to be able to help outline everything in the future so that you have as much certainty as possible and we can actually honor our usual contingency.
You bring up the word recommend, and I really think that it's a great tactic. to use that sort of phrasing, you know, when you're delivering these different phases, is that, especially like in design, if you are saying, this is our recommendation, then they get to choose. Then there's a real reason for them to even want to break it up, because they might not need all the things that they thought they need, right? So it may be to their advantage, right, to be able to have that flexibility and choice, and then using, you know, doing this sort of recommendation sort of approach. Yes.
I think like when you're doing the phases, like after the discovery phase and you're planning the next phases, like there's like you can really be thoughtful about the order of what you're putting into each phase. So like for one thing, you want to make sure that if you're going to have the same team available the whole time, you want to like distribute the work so that there's like front end and back end work in each phase. And like obviously there's a certain amount of back end work you have to get done before you can do any front end work. So you have to think about that, like what can you get done quickly that will get the front end workers already being able to work, so they're not like waiting and held up. So like we want to get like all the parts of the team firing and get that lined up right. But then also you want to think about a lot of times if there's like a content portion of the project, then it makes sense to do the CMS side of the work first, that you can get the content editors in there as soon as possible, and like have that be like a milestone. Like at this point in the project, you'll be able to start adding content while we like finish all of like the front end.
Yeah, and I've seen, I don't know if that you're talking about an example, but I have seen in some cases where content editors can start, you know, plugging stuff in pretty soon, pretty early,
Yeah.
you know, because we've already made some architectural decisions, you know, in the POC phase or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I hear you. I think you're right that identifying those dependencies between teams is really important when you're doing planning, because then you can take advantage of not only knowing what you should or shouldn't focus on within a particular phase or planning interval, but just in general that you are able to you know, have efficiency gains or velocity increases, you know, across the entire project, right? Because you're having everybody kind of in the room that needs to be in the room at the right time.
Yeah. Like you want to unlock like everyone on your team so that they're able to like start working as soon as possible by like doing things in the best possible order.
Setting everybody up for success during next, you know, sprint or next planning interval that they're having to work on the things that they need to work on. For sure, I agree. I did want to maybe take a couple minutes. I know that I'm almost end of the session here, but just to talk a little bit about avoiding burnout. You know, I think that particularly the phased approach can help a lot with avoiding burnout, because you're, again, focusing on that particular phase. And it's, you know, smaller chunks, easier to swallow, that sort of thing. You know, it's all about mental capacity in a lot of ways. But also, you know, I think more specifically, when you're talking about your ceremonies, you know, there may be some things that you don't always talk about at the beginning of the project. Like things like, you're laughing at the little comic on the side here, yeah. Things like, how often are you meeting? You know, not only how many times, but how many people. Like, you know, it's about really having a good handle as a team, aligning on like what is really necessary to be valuable to the team to move forward. So things like also dealing with what your sprinting looks like. You know, like how long are your sprints? You know, and if you have multi-matrix, for instance, and this is what Scaled Agile talks a lot about, is that you really want to line up your sprint, not only your planning intervals, but your sprinting as well across teams. You don't want to have like design team going on a 1-week sprint and dev team that's running at the same time on a 2-week sprint. You're probably going to have some conflicts there. So kind of aligning with your sprinting across teams as well. Just to talk about during sprinting, you're going to maybe have these ceremonies specifically like scrubbing or backlog grooming, as it's also called, estimation, placement. You know, these are sorts of things that you want to do during the beginning. You're going to want to have your stand-ups. But honestly, these two, or this one or two that I think I might mention here, yeah. Having internal demos is really important. Well, I'm not talking about client demos here. I'm talking about internal demos. So let's imagine a world where you're building an interface, a new component, and you've had your back-end team create all the fields and architecture around a thing, and then the front-end team comes in and does all the styling, which is great and all. But if you don't meet and align before you talk to the client, there may be some assumptions that one person made versus the other, and they were not quite right, or it didn't work and doesn't function exactly the way that we expected it to. So having those internal demos, and I'm not saying the same day, I'm saying a couple days before you have your client demo, give your people time to, right set and make some changes if necessary. That's really important, and I've seen it not happen. So I wanted to kind of be strong with that. Another thing is retrospectives. Let me ask this question. How many of you do retrospectives in your projects at all? 2? Maybe 3?
We found that they were not helpful. I mean, because we had an ongoing team that's been going on for years, and they're more like, they're great for recognition and like, hey, this is good, but not a lot came out of them. So I'm like, okay, we're just not doing them anymore.
Okay.
But in our case, it was, if I had a short-term project, I mean, this is a really long-term project that
Sure.
the team has been together for a long time.
Oh.
And I hope that they feel comfortable enough to come to me as the project manager and say, hey, we should change this and that. And we'll have them if we have like an incident. We're like, oh, we should really talk about that.
Okay.
But
yeah.
on an ongoing basis, we're like,
Great point. It is a kind of when it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that when it's gonna be valuable when you have a lot of new features happening, when you have new team members on, when you have maybe even new client contacts, when you have like more sort of changes happening with the structure of the project or the team, you probably want to do retrospectives. But I am surprised that like in build projects, which I think that it's really useful to have like just short retrospective, talk about what worked, what didn't work, what could have been better, and what action items can we take forward into the next sprint in order to be more efficient as a team, in order to avoid this pitfall that we had this time around. Those sorts of things can really cut down on those quick conversations, can help to really cut down on those cost overruns and not meeting milestones and all of these things, and avoiding burnout, really. I mean, how many times have you had like you run through sprint, you feel like nobody's listening to you, or you're getting frustrated with a thing, or you have a resource that's frustrated with a thing, and they just don't have the space to talk about it. And so giving them at the end of the sprint or right before the next sprint a moment to just voice their grievances, and talk about it might be a good thing to do. That's my suggestion.
I could see like, I usually do it as sort of like just a quick thing as part of another meeting, unless somebody has brought something up that we need to talk about, because otherwise I find that there's just a lot of dead air where it's like the developers, they are just thinking about development, and when you bring them to a meeting, they're just like, let me get back to what I was doing, and they're not like fully present, and then you ask them, so has anybody got some process ideas?
Yeah, that's exactly.
It
was sort of like,
work.
Yeah, everything's great, it's running along great. And
They have an idea, but...
And things were running pretty smoothly, but yes, we always had, we talk about it more in like a stand-up, or we'd have a separate meeting, or talk about things like that. So we switched like from every sprint to like a month, we just
I mean, as long as you're having them at regular intervals, I think that's the point, is like, don't just have it at the end of your project after you've delivered it to the client. I mean, that's not going to be really helpful, I don't think,
But for us,
right?
we've been on this, it's an ongoing, long time project, so it's not like
That's kind of
the end of
specific.
this, like, I don't even know when the end will ever be.
Chris?
I think it is cool to be, as you were saying, compartmentalizing the topic, right? So you're not doing that, keeps your sprints, your stand-ups brief, right, as they're meant to be. You're not going to every topic every time. You didn't do that last week. You didn't do this yesterday. That is all just, here's this appropriate time. We're going to talk about it. And I hear you on like technical lines and being disengaged. That's not my problem. but who is, in my opinion, my experience, who is on the technical team that's listening, right, are those who are responsible. And, you need to most often convey what well and what didn't. I mean, to give recognition when due, and, to be able to say, hey, that interval just now went well, or, hey, that was a disaster, and like this and this and this need to improve, or I don't know what to tell
and
you.
then what will you keep, and that sort of thing too. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Or even to admit your own failings. Hey, I didn't see this coming. I didn't realize what was going to happen.
Well, and giving someone an
sorry
opportunity
for
to
spinning you out.
sort of apologize, sort of, to
Absolutely.
the group, like where they might feel like they have to go individually to people, and I don't know,
The structure.
the space, the sort of mental space, right? There was one other something that I thought of to do with, one thing that I've had challenging is like what you were talking about, is if you just kind of ask the question of like, how's things going? Do you feel good? That might not be as valuable. And the way to kind of break that down or get rid of that issue is, I found to use a tool like use Miro, or use some retro tools that are out there that I can't think of the name of right now, where each member, you take like a certain portion of minutes, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever you want to do, and have them independently write down those things. And then in their column or in their whatever, and then that kind of disconnection of not having to like say it out front, because they don't have their thoughts completely there, until they really think about it. That can really help to break, to prevent or to get people to really talk about things more openly than they might not otherwise. So I don't know if that might be a thing that you feel like there's a sneaking suspicion that people aren't really just talking. You might try a tactic like that, to have this sort of independent, write it down, and then we're going to come back together and talk about all those things.
They need time to think. Like when you just ask them, it's like,
Yeah, but if
they
you
need to take
schedule it,
time.
yeah, but if you schedule it every 2 weeks or whatever, they should, Retro IO is a really good resource.
Yes,
So
there we
you
go.
can do that.
Retro
and I
IO.
was just like, okay, and then I'd be like, you have to put in at least 2.
Yeah, and hold them
Always
to it to do the things. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're talking more like an ad hoc sort of like
Well,
where
we
you're
used to have every
async
sprint.
situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we used to do them all
Oh,
together. We
during the meeting?
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay, good.
Give like 5,
Good.
10 minutes at the very beginning, and
Perfect. Yeah.
again, it'd be like, but yeah, like, please put at least 1.
Right. Right.
You have at least one nice thing to say, don't you?
Well, and then maybe instead of it just being like what went well, like maybe you can ask more specific questions, like how could we pick up the pace? like how could we solve like whatever problem we're having? Like does
What
it-
could have been better?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just-
Or an action sort of like item specifically. Like, yeah. Yeah, I think the what learned question is sometimes really good too. Like just being able to share like, oh, I learned about this neat little thing I could do in my tooling that I am using, or whatever the case may be. Just getting people to share, I think, is really important there. But really, I think my strategy is focus on next, because no matter what we, do in the retros and we talk about and celebrate and everything else, having this like focused on what's next really keeps that momentum. Not to say that we're forgetting, we're taking it forward, the things we need to, but having this focus on next really keeps this sort of positivity up, avoids this burnout as well. And we already really kind of talked about like what ceremonies do you plan and what do you do, but do you feel like in general that you do a lot of these things, any of them? Let me ask this one more in particular. Is there a particular ceremony that you're not doing that you've been convinced by my talk to start doing? Anybody? No? Maybe? No, I hope so. I hope that maybe at least an internal demo or 2 happens more often. Maybe not the retros necessarily, we've got that figured out. Maybe more frequent stand-ups. I think that if you make them quick, like they're supposed to be, it's not about like, I'm saying the same thing every time. It's sometimes with those stand-ups I've found, it does take 2 or 3 times for them to say, I'm still blocked on this, for someone to actually help. But if you didn't have those 3 times, you might have reached near the end of your sprint and never gotten it taken care of, right? So just, have those ceremonies if you can. Last but not least, there are some time management sort of tactics that you might want to discuss with your team, making sure that they plan their focus time, for instance, blocking out time on their calendar for certain things. They can use color coding. That's another suggestion that I have. If I were to show you my calendar, it has a billion colors for a billion different projects that I have going on at one time or another, and it really helps to keep me organized. When you're working on a specific tasks, adding the key to the event. So like if you're using a time management tracking system, having this sort of cross information from your calendar to your tasks might be helpful as well. But leave room for breaks. I think that's kind of a big thing that a lot of people forget when they start to actually calendar out all their focus time.
Put your lunch on there.
Put your lunch on there, put your breaks in there, yeah. To do with project organization, you want to make sure to cover things like having products and features, epic stories, tasks, and bugs, that you're tagging things like needs discussion, or if it's in regards to a specific component, it really helps people to kind of organize and focus around those things. Have your due dates in there. It'll limit, and limit to only hard deadlines. I would say that some people get a little crazy with putting due dates on tasks. You probably only need them for things that are really important. Consider, a board per audience. Like if you're in Jira, for instance, you might create a separate board for the design team, front-end team, back-end team, client. They might have a different sort of view. So create separate boards for your audiences. Dashboarding might be helpful as well in the sense of using, like in this case of Jira as an example, you can take and create widgets based off of Jira queries and put it on a Confluence page. And I found that really helpful, especially when managing multiple clients at the same time, that I can just have, these are the things that are still open, these are the things that are closed, and I can just copy that meeting report every single time, or that status report every single time, and it kind of auto updates from one meeting to another. So using some dashboarding. You leverage your release tracking as well, to be honest. I don't think that people do this all the time either. I've often had like development teams tracking releases of versioning and the version control system only, but like if you can get them to show that on the project management side as well, not only is it exposing that information to the entire team and or the client potentially if they're in there, but it's a place where that they can make more intentional release notes based on that particular item. Now this may be in code, and I agree that in code is a good idea as well, but think about having release tracking on your project management system as well. I went over this before, but just to reiterate that it's really good to have an overview page for onboarding purposes. Things like sites and environments, contacts, contracts, strategic initiatives can all live on like one place for the project, one page, and anybody can come and take a look, whether they're managing it for you or they're just needing to know where all the information is. Maybe you're onboarding somebody new. Having that page set up is a really good idea. There's a couple other things which I won't really go over too much, but I don't know if everybody knows about browser tab organization. I think it's been around long enough here in the past year that most people do it, but in Chrome and many other browsers, you have the option to group your tabs, and or color code your tabs. So doing things like that. Also, think about integrations. Things like email to Slack, email to Jira, Slack to Jira. Having this sort of information shared across when changes are happening is a good idea there. Status automation. If you've never heard of it, there's a couple suggestions that I have here. Reclaim AI and Don't Interrupt.app will take from your Google Calendar, for instance, and update the Slack status to show that you're either in focus time or you're in a meeting. Not just meeting, but that it's a little bit more descriptive to say what's going on with you at that moment, so you can reduce noise and interruptions. Also, taking a sort of inbox zero approach. Think about responding or reminding, marking your messages, whether it's in email or in Slack, to either respond immediately or remind yourself to do that later. Again, this is, just to get in the flow, to keep yourself focused. And any other tips and tools that you could think of that you want to mention beyond this that are helpful to your teams to stay in the flow?
I like the GitHub Jira integration, as you were saying.
GitHub Jira?
As far as the release updates and so forth, that I think unifies for folks that aren't in code, that are the mouthpiece potentially, to the client or other stakeholders.
And in order to add on that with the Jira, GitHub, or repo combination, sometimes it can be helpful to reduce noise to have like a separate notification channel for the project, but it's specifically notifications so that anybody that's interested can intentionally go in there and look at that versus having it in the main channel along with all the other chat that's going on. But I like it. I agree with you on that one. Okay, before we close out, I just wanted to make sure to mention Chris and Beth back here from Esteemed. I am here today because of them. So because of sponsors like Esteemed, I'm able to share this information with you here today. They are solving resourcing challenges for web projects. Please go to them and their table in the Commons area to access a vast network of their top-tier talent. They have flexible resourcing solutions tailored to your project needs, and really, Chris and Beth, they're great people, and they're here to help get you to your next with the right resources. So please stop by the channel and or look at this esteem.io/about us. A couple other things on my side. Just wanted to mention, I have a bag that, is it on right now? I don't know. It's been flashing at you the whole time. I run a digital career sandbox. As a person that's been involved in tech layoffs in the past couple of years, I've found it really valuable to have a support group, which that's what we do, is we just talk about job opportunities, networking support tips. I run a Monday Mess every Monday, as you can assume, by the name of it. Here's a QR code. Here's a LinkedIn if you want to come visit. And just stop by. We'll hang out. We'll talk about what you might have going on. Or if you know somebody, more specifically, that's needing to have help with their next job opportunity, I can help them out with a support group and or point them over to Esteem to help them with their next. Also, MidCamp. I'm involved with a lot, you guys. I'm sorry. I am the lead organizer for MidCamp. It's going to be May 20th to 22nd, Chicago. Come to MidCamp Slack and volunteer. We're looking for organizers. We're getting our sponsor stuff together right now. Marketing actually is pretty big right now. We're gonna spread our word everywhere. Oh, and I might on the recording here say Dries is going to be at our event, so we're really excited about that. Please come and have a chat with Dries at MidCamp. And if you want to connect with me, this is me at Technora or technora.com. So thank you. I appreciate everyone for coming and participating, and you all have a wonderful rest of your event.